At the dawn of the 20th century, in the small island city of Key West, Florida, where the streets were narrow and lined with colorful conch houses, and where the air was always thick with the smell of salt water and the hum of cicadas, a boy named Robert Eugene Otto received a gift that would change his life, and perhaps the lives of countless others, for generations. The gift was a doll, 3 feet tall, stuffed with straw and rags, dressed in a miniature sailor's suit that matched the boy's own clothes. Its face was round, with button eyes that seemed almost too knowing, a small nose, and a thin, unsettling smile stitched into its fabric. It was not a doll that looked playful or sweet, but one that seemed to carry an odd weight, as though something watched through its simple features. The boy's family called him Gene, and from the moment the doll entered his hands, Gene formed a bond with it so intense, so unnatural, that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. No one remembers exactly who gave Gene the doll. Some say it was a gift from his grandfather, purchased in Germany from the Steiff Company, one of the earliest makers of teddy bears and toys. Others claim the doll was delivered by a servant of the Otto household, a woman of Bahamian descent who, according to legend, was mistreated by the family and sought revenge through dark magic. Whichever version one chooses to believe, the origin of the doll was already cloaked in mystery. What is certain is that from the moment Gene laid eyes on it, he adored it. He named the doll after himself, Robert, and though many children named their toys for Gene, the act carried a strange kind of power. From then on, when someone said Robert, it wasn't clear whether they were addressing the boy or the doll. The Otto house was large and filled with echoes, the kind of old Key West mansion where sunlight could look warm in the day, but shadows stretched unnervingly long at dusk. Ginny carried Robert with him everywhere. He spoke to him constantly, in whispers and giggles, as though they shared secrets no one else could hear. At first, the family dismissed it as Achilde's imagination, nothing unusual for a boy who was creative and lonely. But soon they noticed something peculiar. When Gene spoke, there were times they heard another voice responding, a deep, gravelly tone too low for a child, too strange to belong to anyone else. The servants swore they heard it. Guests insisted they did as well. And when they asked Gene who was speaking, he would shrug and say simply, Robert. It might have been dismissed as ventriloquism, as a boy's clever trick. But then the household began to change. Strange noises echoed through the halls at night. Objects were moved from one room to another. Neighbors claimed to see the doll standing at the window, peering down at the street when Gene was not at home. At times, the family would awaken to the sound of furniture overturning, only to find Gene in bed, trembling, insisting that Robert had done it. It wasn't me, he would say, wide-eyed, clutching the doll. Robert did it. The parents, unsettled, tried to take the doll from Gene, but the boy resisted with such desperation that they relented. And so Robert remained, a constant presence in the Otto home. As Gene grew older, so too did the stories. Servants whispered that they saw the doll blink, that its head turned when no one touched it. A maid once fled the house after swearing she heard the doll giggle. Footsteps were heard in empty hallways. Doors slammed on their own. And always Gene said the same words. Robert did it. As the years passed, Gene became an artist, eccentric and imaginative, but he never let goof Robert. Even as a grown man, married and returned to live in the family home, the doll remained with him. His wife Anne grew uneasy, disturbed by the way her husband still spoke to Robert as if it were alive. Sometimes she heard Gene arguing with the doll, his voice raised in anger followed by silence, as though he were listening to someone respond. At other times she swore she heard a voice that was not Gene's, low and mocking, echoing through the room. Neighbors reported again seeing the doll at the windows, staring out with its button eyes. Tourists whispered that they saw it move. Children refused to walk near the house, saying Robert watched them, that he wanted to follow them home. And through it all, Gene clung to him, insisting Robert was not just a toy, but something more. When Gene finally died in 1974, Robert remained. Left alone in the house, he was eventually moved to the East Martello Museum in Key West, where he resides to this day, encased in glass, still dressed in his sailor's suit, still staring with those button eyes that seem to follow visitors across the room. And even there, behind the safety of glass, the legend grew darker. Museum staff reported hearing footsteps when no one was near. Visitors claimed the doll's expression changed from one moment to the next. Cameras malfunctioned in his presence. and letters began to arrive. Hundreds of them, apologies from people who had mocked Robert during their visit, only to suffer accidents, illness, or tragedies afterward. But all of that is part of the legacy. In the beginning, in the quiet house on Eaton Street in Key West, it was simply a boy and his doll. A boy who gave the doll his own name. A boy who whispered to it in the night. A boy who told his parents over and over again when strange things happened. Robert did it. As Gene Otto grew older, Robert never left his side. What had begun as the innocent companionship of a boy and his toy deepened into something stranger, something that disturbed even those closest to the family. Friends who visited the Otto household were unnerved to find the doll seated at the table, given its own place, or positioned in a chair by the window, as if it were a member of the household. Gene spoke to Robert as though he were a brother, a confidant, sometimes even an adversary. At times his conversation seemed one-sided. At other times those who listened swore they heard a second voice, answering back, a voice that could not have belonged to Gene. The household staff continued to whisper. They claimed the doll was responsible for chaos within the house. Children's toys destroyed, kitchen utensils missing, furniture overturned, always with no explanation other than Gene's simple refrain. Robert did it. His parents, torn between concern for their son's mental state and fear of the uncanny, tolerated the bond. But there was unease in the way their son clung to the doll even as adolescence gave way to adulthood. When Gene left to study art in Chicago and later in Paris, Robert remained at the house. For a time, life within the Otto home seemed calmer. But the neighbors insisted that when they walked past the house on Eaton Street, they still saw the doll in the windows, moving from one to another as if pacing. Children claimed Robert would appear one day in the turret room, the next in the parlor, and then suddenly vanish altogether. Stories spread through Key West that Robert was no mere doll, but a vessel for something dark, something watching and waiting. When Gene returned to Key West with his new wife Anne, he brought Robert back into his daily life with the devotion of a man greeting an old friend. Anne, however, was unsettled. She had expected her husband's eccentricities as an artist, but she had not expected to live with a doll that her husband treated with reverence and fear in equal measure. Gene placed Robert in a special chair in their bedroom, sometimes even in the bed itself. Anne objected, but Gene grew defensive, insisting Robert had always been part of his life, that she needed to accept him. It was then that Anne began to notice the same things the Otto family had spoken of for years. At night, footsteps echoed in the halls when Gene was asleep beside her. The sound of giggling drifted from darkened rooms. Doors that had been locked in the evening were found wide open by morning. And most disturbing of all, Anne began to swear that she saw the doll's expression change. Its stitched smile seemed to curl wider at times, or its button eyes appeared sharper, more watchful. On more than one occasion, she woke in the night to find Robert no longer sitting in his chair, but at the foot of the bed, staring silently at them as they slept. Neighbors, too, kept their distance from the house. Children whispered that Robert did not like to be mocked, that if you laughed at him or made faces, bad luck would follow. Some swore he blinked when they walked past. Others claimed to hear tapping on the glass of the turret window, as if Robert were trying to get out. Few dared to go near after dark. The legend was growing, and with it, the fear that Robert's presence was not confined to the walls of the Otto home. Gene, for his part, seemed caught in Robert's thrall. He would spend hours alone in his studio, painting while the doll sat in a chair nearby. Visitors said they heard him speaking, pausing, and then nodding, as though listening to responses that came from no human lips. On some nights, neighbors claimed they heard shouting from inside the house, Gene's voice rising in argument. Yet when the shouting stopped, silence would fall, heavy and oppressive, as if something inhuman had answered him and ended the debate. Anne grew increasingly desperate. She begged Gene to lock Robert away, to put him in the attic or give him to the museum. Sometimes Gene relented, carrying the doll up the narrow attic stairs and leaving him among the dust and cobwebs. But no matter how many times Robert was locked away, he always returned. Gene would find him seated in his favorite chair by the window, waiting patiently, his button eyes fixed forward as though no attic could contain him. The servants, already fearful, began to leave one by one. They claimed they could not endure the sounds, the movements, the sense of being watched wherever they went. One maid told a neighbor she had been carrying laundry through the hall when she felt small hands tug at her skirt. Turning, she expected to see a child, but there was no one, only Robert, seated on a chair nearby, his smile mocking her fear. She left the house that very night and never returned. By this time, the legend of Robert had spread beyond Key West. Sailors passing through the port spoke of the doll. Tourists who glimpsed him in the window carried tales home with them. And always the stories grew darker. Robert caused accidents. Robert cursed those who disrespected him. Robert ruined lives. The phrase "Robert did it" became more than Gene's excuse. It became a whispered warning. As Gene's health declined in his later years, he still kept Robert close. Even in his final days, the doll sat in a chair beside his bed watching him fade. Some say Gene's last words were spoken not to his wife, but to the doll. Others claim that as Gene breathed his last, neighbors passing the house heard faint laughter, childlike and cruel, echoing from the turret room. When Gene died in 1974, Anne quickly locked Robert in the attic. She had no love for the doll, no loyalty to her husband's obsession. She wanted him out of sight, out of mind, away from her life. Yet even then the disturbances continued. Visitors to the house reported hearing footsteps in the attic, giggles that echoed through empty rooms, and the sense that the doll was still moving, still alive, still waiting. Anne lived out her final years in the house. But she never overcame her dread of Robert. When she passed away, the property changed hands, and with it, the fate of the doll. New owners discovered Robert in the attic. His sailor suit faded, his fabric worn with age, but his presence as powerful as ever. They reported strange occurrences almost immediately. Objects misplaced, voices in the dark, and Robert appearing in different rooms despite being locked away. Terrified, they sought a permanent solution, and so Robert was donated to the East Martello Museum in Key West, a fortress-like structure with thick stone walls that had once guarded the island against attack. The curators placed him in a display case, his sailor suit carefully cleaned, a small toy dog added to his side. They thought perhaps that would be the end of it. Perhaps Robert would be content behind glass, but the moment he arrived, the staff realized that Robert's story was far from over. When Robert the doll was finally placed inside the East Martello Museum, many in Key West breathed a sigh of relief. The Otto house had long been whispered about as cursed, a place of shadows and secrets. Now the strange doll was removed from its turret room and locked away inside a fortress of stone, where tourists could gawk at him safely behind glass. It seemed for a time like the perfect solution. Yet those who believed in Robert's power knew better. A cage may hold a beast, but it cannot strip it of its hunger. From the very first weeks at the museum, staff noticed unsettling occurrences. The doll was given a display case, seated in a chair with a small toy dog at his side. He was placed where visitors could see him clearly, his sailor suit neatly pressed, his button eyes catching the museum lights. Yet employees swore that when they opened in the morning, Robert's position was not always the same. Sometimes his head was tilted differently. Other times his hands rested in new poses, and occasionally his toy dog appeared to have shifted places on its own. At first, the curators suspected one another of moving him as a prank. But when Noon admitted to it, the laughter died, replaced by unease. Visitors began to report the same strange feelings that neighbors of the Otto house had described for decades. As they stood before Robert's case, they felt watched, their skin prickling with goosebumps even in the Florida heat. Some claimed his expression changed as they stared at him, his stitched smile curling wider, his eyes darkening with malice. Children sometimes burst into tears for no reason at all, pointing at Robert and begging to leave. Adults, skeptical at first, walked away pale and shaken, glancing nervously over their shoulders as if expecting the doll to follow. Then came the accidents. Tourists who laughed at Robert, who posed mockingly beside his case or tapped on the glass, often suffered mishaps soon after. Flat tires, broken bones, sudden illnesses, each misfortune seemed connected to disrespect shown in the museum. One man, after ridiculing the doll, crashed his rental car on the way out of Key West. Another fell from a ladder at home only days later, breaking both arms. Word spread quickly, and soon Robert's reputation was no longer just a local legend. He became known across the country, and eventually around the world, as the doll who punished those who mocked him. The museum began receiving letters, at first a few, then dozens, and eventually hundreds each year. These were not simple fan notes but desperate apologies. Visitors who had laughed at Robert wrote begging forgiveness, convinced he had cursed them. Some letters came from as far away as Europe and Asia, filled with stories of sudden bad luck, unexplained tragedies, or streaks of misfortune that began only after they disrespected the doll. Each letter pleaded the same thing: forgiveness. Staff began pinning these letters on the walls of Robert's display room, until the case itself became surrounded by an aura of guilt and desperation, a shrine of human fear. Even among those who treated him with respect, strange events were common. Cameras malfunctioned in his presence, their batteries drained or their lenses fogged as though something unseen interfered. Photographs often developed blurred, with Robert's face distorted or obscured, as if the doll resisted being captured on film. Some visitors claimed their phones froze completely while recording video near his case, only to resume working the moment they stepped away. The museum staff learned quickly that Robert demanded a kind of etiquette. Before entering his room, many visitors now greet him politely, some even asking permission before taking a photograph. Guides warn tourists never to mock him, never to tap on the glass, and never to question his power aloud. And still, despite the warnings, a handful of those who disrespected him every year continued to write letters of apology once their luck turned sour. What unsettled the curators most, however, was the sense that Robert remained aware of his visitors. Security cameras placed in the room sometimes captured strange anomalies: shadows passing behind him when no one was present, faint knocks from inside the case, or what appeared to be subtle changes in his posture. One guard swore that, while making his rounds late at night, he saw Robert's reflection move independently in the glass, tilting its head toward him while the doll itself remained motionless. He never worked the night shift again. For those who believe in curses, Robert embodies the perfect vessel. Unlike Annabelle, whose legend grew through the work of the Warrens, Robert's story thrives directly through the fear of those who encounter him. He does not need a priest's testimony or Hollywood's exaggerations. He needs only the frightened letters of countless strangers, written in shaking hands, confessing their guilt and begging for mercy. That paper trail, those thousands of apologies, have become the evidence of his power. Over the decades, Robert's fame has grown. Television crews, paranormal investigators, and authors of the supernatural have all made pilgrimages to Key West to stand before him. Some leave humbled, others shaken. A few leave defiant, only to later regret their arrogance. Each encounter adds to his legend, making Robert not merely an artifact in a museum, but a living myth. He is part of Key West's identity now, a local treasure of terror, drawing crowds as much for his eerie presence as for the fear he inspires. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Robert's story is not the accidents or the letters, or even the photographs that fail to capture him. It is the idea that he chooses his targets. Many respectful visitors leave untouched, unharmed, their curiosity satisfied. But those who cross a line, those who mock him, those who doubt, those are the ones who suffer. It is as though Robert listens, judges, and then decides who deserves his wrath. Inside his glass case at the East Martello Museum, Robert sits silently, dressed still in his sailor suit, his toy dog forever at his side. His button eyes reflect the lights of the room, but many swear that behind them something else is watching, something patient, something that has endured for more than a century, feeding on fear and respect alike. And as the letters continue to pour in, as stories spread across the internet, as television specials retell his legend, Robert remains unchanged but never passive. The doll that Gene Otto once cherished has become a global icon of dread, an artifact that proves how deeply Astery can root itself into human imagination and belief. Yet those who have stood before him insist it is more than imagination. They insist the power is real. They insist Robert knows exactly who mocks him and who respects him. And they insist that those who laugh in his face will not be laughing for long. Robert the doll remains, more than a century after his creation, one of the most unsettling figures in the world of the paranormal. What began as a gift to a boy in Key West has grown into a global legend, a story retold in hushed whispers, in travel blogs, in documentaries, in late-night conversations where skepticism gives way to fear. Robert is no longer just a doll in a glass case. He has become a symbol, a reminder of the thin veil between the ordinary and the uncanny, and of the power that belief itself can summon. At the East Martello Museum, his presence has transformed an otherwise quiet historical site into a destination for thousands of pilgrims each year. Some arrive out of curiosity, drawn by the macabre thrill of standing before a cursed object. Others come out of fear, convinced that acknowledging Robert in person is the only way to break a streak of misfortune that began after mocking him online or speaking his name in jest. Guides tell visitors to greet him politely, to ask permission before taking photographs, and to never, under any circumstance, ridicule him. For many, this etiquette has become ritual, an acknowledgement that Robert demands respect, whether he is truly haunted or not. But Robert's influence extends far beyond the museum walls. The letters of apology that arrive daily, written in every language imaginable, have become one of the most tangible signs of his legacy. They are not just from tourists who visited in person, but also from those who encountered his image in books, films, or online. People confess their sins against him, laughing at his appearance, daring to speak of him disrespectfully, or simply doubting his power, and they beg forgiveness in ink. The museum has collected thousands of these letters, an archive of human fear, guilt, and desperation, all directed at a doll with button eyes and a sailor's suit. With the rise of the internet, Robert's legend has only deepened. His story circulates on forums, on YouTube channels, in viral TikTok videos where creators test their luck by mocking him, only to later post updates of misfortunes that seem to follow. The line between folklore and fact blurs in the digital age, but what matters most is that people believe. Every new video, every repost, every whispered story told in the dark adds to Robert's myth, feeding the idea that he is not a relic of the past, but a living curse still at work. Hollywood has, of course, noticed. After the explosion of Annabelle's fame in the Conjuring films, Robert was quickly compared to her, often called the real Annabelle, or the doll scarier than Annabelle. Independent horror films have been made in his name, some dramatizing his origins with the Otto family, others imagining his escape from the museum. While these films rarely capture the eerie simplicity of the real Robert, they have amplified his fame, introducing him to audiences who might otherwise never have heard of the doll in Key West. Yet even with all the modern interpretations, the true terror of Robert lies not in the films or the museum displays, but in the personal experiences of those who encounter him. Staff at the East Martello Museum still speak of nights when the air around his case feels heavy, when they hear faint tapping from inside the glass, or when the security cameras flicker strangely in his room. Visitors still report cameras failing, sudden waves of nausea, or the creeping sense that Robert is following them with his eyes. And the letters continue to arrive from every corner of the globe, as though Robert's curse can reach across oceans and continents, carried not by his physical presence but by his story. This is the heart of Robert's legacy, the way fear transforms into belief, and belief transforms into reality. Skeptics argue that the misfortunes attributed to him are coincidences, the product of guilt and imagination. Psychologists say the letters are evidence of the human need to externalize blame, to find a scapegoat for life's accidents and tragedies. But for those who have stood before him, who have looked into his face and felt something looking back, those explanations feel inadequate. To them, Robert is not just a story, he is a force. Today, Robert is an economic and cultural cornerstone for Key West. Tourists flock to see him, to stand nervously before his case, to whisper a polite greeting and snap a cautious photo. He is featured on merchandise, in ghost tours, and in countless retellings. But unlike other tourist attractions, Robert carries a sense of real danger. Visitors laugh nervously, but the laughter is always followed by a moment of silence, by the lingering thought, what if their stories are true? And perhaps that is Robert's greatest power. Unlike Annabelle, whose story has been filtered through Hollywood and the Warrens, Robert's legend has grown directly from the voices of those who meet him. Every apology letter is a testimony, every broken camera a witness, every nervous visitor a believer. Robert thrives on this cycle, on the fear that spreads from one person to the next, on the weight of a century of stories that cannot be disproven. As the world grows more connected, so too does Robert's reach. He has become a global myth, a cautionary tale about the dangers of disrespect, about the idea that even the most ordinary object can become extraordinary when wrapped in enough belief. He reminds us that evil, or at least the perception of it, does not always hide in shadows or graveyards. Sometimes, it sits quietly behind glass, smiling with button eyes, waiting for the next person foolish enough to test its patience. Robert the doll endures because he is more than a doll. He is a mirror of our own fears, our own need to explain misfortune, our own willingness to believe that the universe punishes arrogance. He is the reminder that sometimes the things we dismiss as silly, as harmless, are the very things that undo us. And whether or not Robert truly moves on his own, whether or not he whispers threats or curses the disrespectful, one thing is certain: thousands of people believe he does. And in the realm of fear, belief is everything. So Robert sits, century after century, behind his glass case in Key West. His sailor's suit may fade, his fabric may age, but his legend does not weaken. Every story, every letter, every frightened whisper adds another layer to his myth. And still he waits, patient and watchful, his stitched smile unchanging, his button eyes fixed forward, because Robert is eternal. Robert is legend. Robert is the doll who never stops watching. And perhaps if you speak his name with disrespect, if you mock him even in the safety of your own home, Robert will hear you. And Robert will not forgive